Welcome to the Business of Travel, the official podcast for the Global Business Travel Association. I'm Catherine Logan, GBTA's Regional Senior Vice President for EMEA and APAC, and I'll be your host for today's episode. We spoke to travel industry colleagues across Europe and Asia and heard their perspective on working culture and its impacts to our industry and business overall. Participants seemed to largely agree that remote working widens talent pools, is important to the next generation of workers, and that working from anywhere is a trend that's here to stay. But they feared more in-person activity when it comes to onboarding new employees, effectively selling and building relationships, and generating a small company culture. Joining me today to discuss this topic are Christian Dahl, EVP People and Culture at BCD, and Rosemary Maloney, Senior Director Corporate Travel at Freeman. Christian, Rosemary, thank you so much for joining us. Now, a big part of our discussion included challenging assumptions and using data as a basis for decisions around policy. If we look back over the results, are there any assumptions the group made that you'd like to challenge? And Rosemary, question to you first.
Yes, and thank you. For me, one of the things was the dynamic between manager and employee is just as effective remote as in person. And how many people disagreed with that? More than half. That was surprising to me, as I feel that you can be just as effective as a remote manager. I've been at companies where my manager has been on the other side of the country, the other side of the world, and obviously we weren't connecting every day in the office. And I think it just changes. I think you can be just as effective. You just have to change your management style. You need to be more open. You need to be just as available as you would be for somebody to come up to your desk. I was surprised how many people said that it was not effective, that they strongly disagreed that you could be effective remote. I think it was interesting to me to see that, especially when we were in Copenhagen, how many people in the room felt that way.
Yeah, if you're a good manager, you're a good manager, and you understand the need of what your team needs and how to motivate and direct them, I guess. But yeah, as you say, Rosemary, different styles are required, or different tools are required. Christian, what about you?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think the feedback we got from the groups, I love the dynamic of getting their feedback. And a little to what Rosemary said about the employee-manager relationship, I was surprised to see how many said that they think work from anywhere is a trend that's here to stay, and yet the concern about how it impacts company culture. And I think that is a dilemma more than anything that we need to make sure that we address as part of this big idea and continue to think about. How do we cater to the fact that we think that it's a staying trend with work from anywhere, and we balance it with the impact on the company culture so that it doesn't have a negative effect, or on the employee-manager relationship, as Rosemary alluded to. And I think those were the two things that stood out to me from that audience feedback in Copenhagen.
Yeah, and I guess there's an element where actually this flexibility could be an integral part of your company culture. So that it's like it's a manifestation of how it is. And so in terms of like how an organization should deal with that, what do you think, Christian, to you, what do you think companies need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think that and we'll come back to this in a little bit as well, I think, because we've talked a lot about since we were together in Copenhagen. And I think the many models of working setups that there is today, you need to figure out what's the one for you. But also in reflection on this, it also has a lot to do with what is the employment situation around the world, right? Is it an employer's market? Is it an employee's market? Are we forced into a situation like we were with COVID, where we had to make it work virtually? And if we see what companies were saying at that time, is it was pleasure in disguise, because it proved that productivity became much greater when we had a virtual setting. And now there seems to be a trend going the other way. And is the trend going the other way as well, that it's becoming more an employer market than it is an employee market? And therefore, we're seeing a shift in some companies wanting to bring their people back to office. So we have this office worker, we have the fully remote, we have the hybrid, and then we have the digital nomads, which we also saw the audience in Copenhagen give us a feedback on how their split was. And I think the definitions of these have to be clear as well. What is hybrid? Is it 2 days in the office and 3 days at home? Is it reversed? And if you're more days in the office than you're home, are you super hybrid? Or I think the definitions of this is something that we need to get acquainted to as well, but really look at what matches and works for me. What's the motivations that I'm doing this? And what is it that I want to signal as an employer? And what do I want to signal as an employee when I have a request to my company of my work situation?
No, absolutely. And it's sort of, moving on to our next session, whenever it comes to working, it's very clear that an organization, probably an employee as well, should be intentional and, thinking about how working policies ultimately contribute to their end goals. So, Christian, can you share some examples of how organizations might use working policy as a tool?
Yeah, I think everybody had to use the virtual as a tool during COVID. We didn't have a choice. So we got forced into it. But now that we have a choice again on how it is that we want to provide working opportunities, I think it's important that we reflect on what it is that we're trying to achieve. Some of the things that we got from the audience in Copenhagen was, and you're early in your career, then maybe office is better than hybrid or virtual for you. But as you get more mature in your work life and you understand what it is that you're contributing to, it may be easier for you to go virtual. But back to Rosemary's point, then it also takes a toll on the leadership, because is the leadership capable of managing a virtual workforce, or do they prefer to have them in the office? So I think there's a lot on impact on the culture in how we did define our work setups, but there's also a culture that drives that. We have some regions in our organization where we don't have any virtual workers because there's a trust issue. Are people as productive as we think they would be in the office? So I think it's what you're trying to achieve drives your model, but also seeing at the work experience, the tenure of your people, how mature would they be in either of the models. And again, the motivation, why are you doing this? Do you have a lot of real estate that you want to make sure is not laid out empty? Do you have work that requires more collaboration face to face than it can be virtual? So always look at what works for us, what works for me, and it may be very different for companies, region to region, country to country.
Yeah, so what, like, sort of the type of organization you're trying to build, what sort of investment you've already made, and how you get to where you need to be, really. Rosemary, how have these impacted you? I know you've been a remote worker, you've been a manager, and obviously you're a highly experienced travel manager. How's this affected you?
It's been really interesting because since COVID, I've worked at companies where I was in the office 5 days a week. I've worked at hybrid and now I'm fully remote. So it's been kind of funny to be in all three different situations in the past 4 years. And I think, as an employee, I think it requires your leadership to trust you and make sure that you're getting stuff done. And so much of travel management, I love whenever I say I'm a travel manager or I'm the head of corporate travel, people go, "Ooh, do you travel all the time? Do you do this?" And sometimes you have to bring it back to reality that 90% of our days are spent in Excel. It's not always the exciting, getting, a nice hotel room. And so as an employee, it really requires leadership to trust that's being done, and to be able to show that. And I think that's something that travel managers do need to get better at, just in general, is showing the value we bring to companies. But again, in that remote model, they really need to see what you're doing, but they need to trust that you're getting it done. And on the other side of that, I had a completely virtual team at Alteryx, where I had somebody in the UK, somebody in Texas, and somebody in California. So it was making sure that we built a strong and cohesive team across the internet, was very vitally important for me. We would have a weekly call where all of us were on it, and then I had my individual one-on-ones. And then on top of that, we had budget every year for everyone to get together for training and all that stuff. And what we did is we got everyone together in one spot. We all went to convention and we would do our training sessions, and then we'd have 2 days of our strategic meetings. And it was a way to make sure my team got to be together and celebrate each other. And I think it really did help in this remote environment to bring, you still need people face to face, even though it's really nice to be home and, able to do stuff on your own.
Yeah, so yeah, and you make a really good point there, don't you? Because any international team is effectively remote.
Yeah.
You're not sitting in the same room all the time, although those opportunities are really so valuable, and we need to make the most of them. So it's almost like there's like a domino effect to the working culture, where you start off, and like if it starts off well and it's purposeful, it can have really, really, really great outcomes. So, as part of our exercise during the big idea session, the room spent some time brainstorming with each other and how working policies might be different in 5 years. And a few themes or predictions emerged. So, many of the groups came to a consensus of that hybrid will continue to be used, but will be shaped or planned versus controlled. So, sort of more of an evolving thing. And others were in favor of a personalized approach that give employees the freedom to choose their own policy, within reason, so there are bumpers in place to navigate what this looks like. So, Rosemary, what ripple effects do you see occurring if employees, or employers rather, choose to go this route and give employees more discretion to choose what works for them?
I think it really can just help build employee trust and loyalty in their organization, being able to kind of build that almost a policy of one. You have, again, the guardrails, and then people can be, instead of being in the office every day, I'm in the office these 3 days every week, and I get to be home on Wednesdays and work from there. I also think what's really good about this is finding the right way to entice people into the office. One of the things my previous company did was Together Tuesdays, where if you were within 60 miles of one of our offices, you were encouraged to go in on Tuesdays. It wasn't mandatory. It wasn't a mandate. It wasn't, you must or you'll be fired. It was come together with us on Tuesday. And that was, in many cases, people block their calendars, so you weren't overly scheduled on Zooms and Teams and all of that stuff. But it was a good way to kind of not only make sure people were using our real estate, but to make sure people came together. And I think with all of those different pieces, so often, people looked at the tech companies before we went into COVID, and you would have the restaurants and site and all of those things, the ping pong tables, the garage band video games, and that was really just to keep you there. It meant you were, instead of at 5 o'clock running out the door, you were like, oh, well, I'll relax for a few minutes before I go, and then you'd find yourself back at your desk at 6. So I think it's important that we need to have this balance, right, to make sure employees aren't constantly in the office and they're not constantly working, but making sure that they are getting their jobs done.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just sounds from, what you said about, your, Together Tuesdays, that was very intentional. And if you were smart about it, you could really harness that time together and make the most of it, while obviously getting a chance to enjoy your colleagues. Another prediction was, going forward, hybrid and remote work will be the norm, but employment law, tax, and contracting need to catch up. Christian, how do working policies impact the wider economy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and allow me to loop back to something Rosemary said just a minute ago, and I'll pick up on the Together Tuesdays, right? I think it's great ideas, and as this was called, the big idea, I think what Rosemary is doing in providing some of the examples of what she's been exposed to, I think it's important as companies make up their own mind as what works for them, is to know that I don't think any company anywhere in the world has this down. Right? Nobody has a template or a formula on how to do this best. So this brainstorming of ideas and experience and what others has done, I think is really, really important as we continue to navigate and set bumpers or guardrails around what virtual work, hybrid, digital nomad means for us. Does it matter where the work gets done as long as it gets done? Does it matter when you do it as long as it's done? No. So this micromanagement of where you in at 8 and where you out at 5 and clock in, clock out, I think we'll have to get used to getting away from that. But in terms of the employment law and the contracting and how does this impact the wider economy, I think that traveling around the world as we get to do from time to time, hearing some of those examples of cities that used to be bursting business environments and business settings in capitals like Paris, that after COVID, now they can't get the real estate rented out to companies because their companies have gone virtual or their employees have gone virtual. They can't change it into residential areas as well. What does that mean for a city like Paris? or they've spent a lot of time in a booming economy building new and fancy office environments in outskirts of cities. What does that mean to the downtowns of cities as well? So I do think that there's a lot of impact that we need to be considerate of as we develop what we think is right for the employer and the employee. So an ear to the ground and listen to what is going on, and at the same time, a really hard balance to strike. What is the bigger impact on economies around the world at the same time as I'm trying to keep my managers and my employees happy? So I think there's a lot of considerations to be had to continue to expand on this idea. And when it comes to the talent pool as well, many relocated during COVID. They moved to somewhere cheaper. If we're now want to bringing them back into office, which is now not only 60 miles away, to Rosemary's example, but could be hundreds of miles away. What does that do to the motivation and the ability for us to do that and the cost related? So a lot of ideas and thoughts to be had and considered as part of this virtual future workforce.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's almost like there's like a macroeconomic and a town planning or a metropolitan planning issue, as well as an organizational one to a managerial one to an individual, as in what do I want from my working environment. And then, obviously we're in the business of travel. And so in terms of travel policies, there's this blending between your work and your personal life, can extend to things like, okay, so what's your technology? What's the technology support you've got so you can work from wherever you are? How do you keep data safe? How do you, potentially if you are like a digital nomad, where's the line between, the awful word of leisure? Where's the line between your leisure and your business travel? Or just like you being where you are. It's a massive topic and one that I'm sure we will be continuing to talk about for a number of years to come. But last question, if you could leave our attendees with any final takeaway, what would that be? And Rosemary, I'm going to come to you first.
The biggest takeaway I would have for people is to, keep in mind that we're constantly evolving. Our industry, the world, we're consistently changing. They say the only thing constant is change. And to be open to those changes. I also think, it's important to look into, a deeper meaning when they are doing things like pushing everyone into the office. Are they trying to get people to leave or something like that? So my biggest takeaway for people is to, be aware, look at what's going around you and, make the changes that you need to.
Thank you. And Christian.
Yeah, I would say, as I've said a couple of times here, make it your own. Let your data guide you. Let your company culture guide you. Let's not copy what others are doing and think that we can force people into what do they say, a square peg in a round hole, right? Because we want to make it work for us. I think the data should guide us. I think it is the motivation of the people that should guide us and figure out what works for us. There's nothing worse than creating a policy that you can't uphold, or you're creating a policy where you're forcing people to make loopholes. I heard this great sentence the other day about coffee batching. So people just flip their badge in the office to go in and have a cup of coffee because it looked good on their attendance sheet, right? That is a way to dodge the whole idea of we're either virtual or we're in office. So make it your own. Make sure that you can preach and implement what it is and be genuine about what it is that you want your workforce to do and why. And that builds on trust as well.
Yeah, so basically go with the grain. Don't try and work against it.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Well, Christian and Rosemary, thank you so much for joining us today. You have been listening to The Business of Travel, the official podcast for the Global Business Travel Association. For more information about GBTA and its work, visit gbta.org. And be sure to rate and review us wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.